Okay, g'day everyone. I'm Lindsay. I'm from Australia, Sydney, Australia. I'm Oxesis on IRC. And today I'm going to be talking about deploying Merb. So the slots are pretty short, so I've sort of condensed the whole talk down to 30 seconds. So you're going to generate a new application, download the Thor task. You're probably going to freeze the app with gems or whatever. So we're using Thor Merb stable here. You wait a bit for it to freeze. You build your app, magic happens. Then you push your app to someplace on the internet. You SSH to that machine, CD to that directory. You run the redeploy task maybe, if you're deploying on a slightly different architecture. And then you start the server. Profit. Everything's awesome, right? You're totally ready and you're production worthy. Except for one small thing. It probably isn't going to stand the test of time. So, your number one priority when building a Merb app should be deployment. So by laying solid foundations and understanding about all the different things related to deployment will sort of help you avoid problems like this. Also later on it makes scaling your application a lot easier. Right, so the first thing people probably want to know about is freezing. There's a lot of talk about it, but it's not really well known exactly how you go about doing it. So, like I was saying before, you download the Thor task into your app. You can use curl if you're on OS 10 and you've got like a shitty BSD user land. So you've got two choices here. You've got a choice of freezing your app to stable or to edge. So the main difference between that is that you're either using RubyGems or you're doing it against Git. The other thing is that it stores the frozen componentry in slightly different locations. For gems, it stores them under Merb gems, and for Git, it installs it under source. Right, but you boot the application in exactly the same way through the bin Merb script. So the question then becomes to freeze or not to freeze. So here's sort of a breakdown about all the different options that you have when you're running with frozen gems, frozen Git, or Thor. So my personal preference is use frozen gems. You get latest stable release. Everything is stored and componentized within the application. You boot it using bin Merb. Then the next option is for maximum deployability on the edge is a frozen Git. So you can be running the latest frozen code, relatively frozen. You can always pull the latest version of Git, but you're always running your application against the version of Git that you have frozen on your local system. You boot it using bin Merb. And then the last option is for sort of like a Thor setup. It's not really the official term, but it's what I like to call it. It's good for multiple apps on the same machine, but it can lead to headaches when like one app or for some reason somebody comes along into the machine and upgrades some gem and all of a sudden like all of your apps don't work. So I really don't recommend doing that. Right, then you've got other Thor tasks for freezing in individual gems, not part of the actual framework. Basically what these tasks do is they actually wrap the gem command anyway. It's sort of like the gem-i that was talked a little bit about yesterday, except that I've found from personal experience the gem-i just really doesn't work all that well. It's not reliable when you're doing things like uninstalling or updating or wiping or whatever. Right, then your other Merb gem task is refreshing the packages, and what that will do is it'll upgrade all the frozen gems within your application to the latest version that's available from RubyForge or wherever. Right, and the last thing you're doing is rebuilding your native extensions. Now this is really useful, well you're going to have to do this if you're going to deploy your application onto an architecture that's different from what you're developing on. So for instance, I do a lot of development on Linux, 32-bit Linux, but I'm frequently deploying to 64-bit Linux. So you use this task once you push your app up to the deployed location, you run it, magic happens, and then you're all good. Right. The next section is all about web servers. So there's actually not too much difference here between what you would probably do with Rails anyway. Everything uses rack, right? It's all relatively standardized. The options are generally Apache and nginx fronting onto Mongrel, Thin, or Ebb. I personally use Ebb, but I've heard really good things about Thin, especially if you're doing crazy things with like, you can get nginx to talk to Thin through Unix domain sockets, so you don't have TCP overhead and that sort of thing. You could do that, but it's probably only worth it if like you're dealing with like millions of serves a day. So a really, really simple Apache configuration. This is basically it, You set the document root. Actually, there needs to be a public on the end of that, but yeah, you get the idea. You set up a mod proxy balancer, and you tell it these are all the different members. You've got a bunch of mongrels that are started up through some process or other. Then you've got your error document, and that's basically it. You'll probably put in a few extra redirects if you want to like redirect portions of your application to like another bit that you're hosting off that machine or onto another server or whatever. You probably want to throw in some logging as well, but that will get the job done. Exactly the same for nginx, except that it's slightly more verbose. I personally use Apache over nginx, but that's just personal preference. I know that most people tend to be deploying under nginx anyway, so. And the configuration works exactly the same as if you're doing it under Rails. Like if you've got nginx configuration or Apache configuration that you're using for Rails, you can most likely just take it and run it with Merb anyway. The other option is passenger. Now, unfortunately, I don't have any usable configuration that I can show you, but it's very, very simple. In the root of your application, you put a config.ru file, and it basically describes how rack is going to initialize Merb. And then you say, within your Apache configuration, my application is over here. It'll start up, it'll boot up your application. You get all the advantages of using passenger, like a lower memory footprint, yeah, that sort of thing. Tighter integration with Apache. Yeah, you know, go look at passenger, it'll tell you all the cool things that it does. Right, the next problem that you have is starting and stopping all your Merb instances. So we have the Merb controller, which is a relatively new addition to the Merb framework. And basically what that does is it gives you the option to do a -k or a -uppercase K. What that basically means is you're either doing a graceful termination of Merb and your collection of mongrels or whatever, or a forceful termination. Right. I personally think that the graceful is better, mainly because of this method and the way that Merb actually uses it. You know, cleaning up PID files, which is sort of useful, especially if you're using monitoring or whatever and checking for the status of those files. Yeah, sort of handy. The other cool thing, while we're on the topic of signals, actually the other thing back here with the graceful versus forceful is that graceful will send an int and forceful will send a kill, so you know a 1 or a 9. Right, so while we're on the topic of signals, there was a recent addition just a few days ago. If you send user 1 to your Merb process, it'll actually dump out a copy of the running configuration for that instance in YAML, which is absolutely fantastic if you want to be able to, you know, see the configuration of that server that's running over there and then replicate it in your testing environment or whatever. Really, really handy. Right, and then for actually starting them, there's this thing called Merb Manage, which I hack on. It's started by a guy over in the UK called L. Draper. So basically what that allows you to do is you've got an init script, so you can go Merb Manage, start, stop, restart, reload. Nice thing about reload is that it's aware of the fast reload command to Merb. So basically what that will do is it'll keep your configuration exactly the same, your loaded gems, your load paths, that sort of thing, but it'll just reload all the application code that you've got within your app. The other nice thing about it, after a recent refactoring that I just did on the plane over the way here, is that if you use, when you're booting Merb, right, or when you use the bin Merb script, you can pass the --help option. It'll give you a huge list of all the potential things that you can do with Merb. The nice thing about it is that I've replicated the configuration structure that you would normally pass when starting up Merb into the configuration file here. So it'll construct a command line for you when you run that init script. With the options here. The other nice thing that I added in was the ability to run a frozen app as opposed to just sort of the Thor system-wide install of Merb. Right, so now we're sort of moving on to a bit more bigger picture things when you're deploying Merb or Rails, but more Merb in this particular case. So for monitoring, I like to use a thing called collectd. Collectd is a lightweight statistic collection daemon with an emphasis on collection, not so much graphing or anything like that. But it's very, very easy to hook into like other graphing solutions. So it has a plugin-based architecture. It's network aware. Uses the round-robin database for providing high-resolution statistics about what your machine is actually doing. Right, so let's just go through a really simple sample configuration that I would use perhaps on a machine that's running Merb. So you see here that I'm loading in a bunch of plugins. I'm checking, you know, all the basics: disk usage, CPU, disk I/O, networking, all that jazz. I've also got two other neat things here. I've got the network plugin and I've got the processes plugin. So the network plugin gives you all the networking stuff for free. So any statistic that it captures on the local system will automatically replicate up to a server that you configure, which I'll show you a bit later. The other thing is the processes plugin. So that basically will give you per process statistics of a process that you specify, or multiple processes, as I'll go into a bit later. Right, so for a lot of those plugins that you saw just back there, we don't actually have to load configuration for them. It does it out of the box. It's really, really simple. So for instance here, I'm just telling it for DF to monitor / interface, specifying a couple of interfaces that I want to monitor. RRD tool if you're storing all of your logs locally, and your networking plugin. So here we're saying we just want to replicate all statistics that we collect up to mymonitoringserver.net. You can specify different ports. It also has the option for UDP multicast. Really, really useful. It's fantastic for tiered architectures as well. Like if you've got like some crazy security setup with multiple zones, you can have like the very low security zone just replicating up to one point, and then you aggregate it there, and then you can have the aggregation point replicated up to someplace else. So it's very, very flexible. Right, the other thing that we do here is we monitor processes. So we're saying here we want to monitor all the Ruby processes that are on your system. So collectd comes with a very simple CGI script that's written in Perl for monitoring, for extracting the data out of the RRDs and viewing them. So here you can see some sample configuration. We've just got some sample graphs, sorry. We're looking at CPU 0 and the number of TCP connections on port 80 on this particular server. Notice that we're getting a reasonable amount of traffic on it. You know, sometimes we're going up to 400 connections per second, which is pretty cool. Mind you, that is TCP keep alive in action. If you actually look at the green bit there, you'll notice the established is sort of fairly consistent at about 22. Right, and then we've got the per process information. So we're just having a look at Ruby here in particular. So you'll see that, like on the top graph, I started a couple of extra Ruby processes there, and you can see it go up. The process state, all that jazz. You can also look at the amount of CPU time a process is taking, number of page faults. You also see the resident set size down the bottom, which sort of makes me go eek, because there was actually a memory leak in Ruby and Merb or something like that, some really, really bizarre interaction. So that was really cool because I was able to see very visually that I had this leak. Monitoring is awesome. So then you've also got the collectd Nagios bridge, and basically what that allows you to do is allows you to query any statistic that's collected by collectd and act like a Nagios plugin. So it'll return 0 for good, 1 for bad, 2 for ugly. So you can point that at any of the statistics that you collected by collectd. And to get an idea about what all those statistics are, they just exist under varlib collectd rd myserver.com or whatever the host name of the server is that you're monitoring. It comes with a whole bunch of plugins, like I was talking about before. In particular, these are the ones that you probably care about in a Merb installation. The libvirt one is absolutely awesome. So if you've got a whole bunch of virtual machines on a host machine, you can run collectd on that host machine. And it will automatically hook into all the virtual machines that you've got running on that and collect the statistics back on that, which is absolutely fantastic. It means you don't have to install all that extra stuff on all those virtual machines that you're running. Memcache, MySQL, and the Postgres ones are all really cool. You can get neat graphs about what sort of queries are being run, how long they're taking, all that jazz. Right, the next big picture thing is configuration management. So I like to use a thing called Puppet. Puppet is 3 things. It's a language for describing how you want your machines to be set up. It's a client and server for distributing that configuration. And it's a library for turning that configuration and applying it to a whole bunch of different operating systems. So it works across all these standard Linuxes, all your standard Unices. There's even like a Windows port that's in motion at the moment. It's not particularly worth using at the moment. But basically, you can use it across. You can describe in a very high-level terms how you want your machine to be configured. And it'll apply it to all these different operating systems. So a couple of the core concepts that you have within Puppet are manifests, types, classes, and nodes. Manifests are what all these other things fall under. So basically, manifests are describing how you want your system to be configured. Then you have types. Types manage individual resources. Things like Apache 2, for instance. I want to make sure that Apache 2 is installed on all my systems. So I go ensure present. Then I want to have the configuration file for Apache. I can do templating with that. It uses ERB. Very sane. You guys have all used ERB before. You know what to expect. You do the permissions that you want on that particular file. Then you want to describe an Apache 2 service. You want to make sure it's always running. And you want to say that whenever the Apache 2 configuration is updated, it should restart Apache, which is fantastic for, I pushed out a brand new version and I've changed a whole bunch of redirect rules, or I've switched to passenger all of a sudden, or whatever. Right, the next thing is classes. Now, classes group similar bits of configuration. So for instance, we've got an Apache 2 type here that we're using, and we're saying we want to make sure it's installed. I can put that in the Apache 2 class. Then I can do other neat things like I want to make sure that I have a passenger class and it inherits the Apache 2 configuration. So it'll install Apache 2 and also make sure that libapache 2 mod passenger is installed. The other nice thing is there's a define. Define it doesn't work the same way. You don't have the ability to do inherency and whatnot. But it allows you to pass in parameters to particular bits of configuration, which are really useful. So for the templating, for instance, like I was showing before, I could pass in port if I wanted to, or I could even set a default port and then override it per host if I need to. Right, and then finally you've got a node configuration. A node configuration applies like a grouping or a type to a node. So basically the way that works is you go include passenger on serve1.skippy.com, which is sort of like a trusty old sopwith, but when you actually want to expand to something slightly larger, you can grow it like that. Or maybe even grow it like that. You can create like a generic Merb node that includes the passenger configuration. And we make all my other nodes inherit from Merb node, and I also on serve3, I want to have a customization for whatever reason. The other nice thing is that it gives you versionable infrastructure for free. So all these manifests, there's nothing magic about them. They're just text files that exist on your file system. So you can use Git if you want to, or you can use some other version control system, whatever makes you happy. So you go into the directory where the manifests are, you do your git init, add whatever you make should happen, and then you push it to your Puppet master, which replicates the configuration out to all the different clients, and then all of a sudden you've got versionable configuration. And you run that configuration for testing on the client with puppeteD test debug. It also has the ability to run as a daemon in the background, or you can spawn it off as a cron job. Or the nice thing about doing it as a daemon that runs in the background is on the Puppet master, you can actually say, update the configuration on all the machines that I know about. And it will go in to the running daemon on the different machines that you're managing and say, do a Puppet run now, and it'll update all the configuration. So in the standard model, it's very much a pool configuration on all the nodes that you're managing. But if you're running in daemon mode with the right configuration, you can get it to actually push out that configuration for you, which is very, very cool. So back in Merb land a bit, with exception handling, use the Merb exceptions plugin. The format should be about the same. I know there's been a lot of work done on it recently, but basically you say exceptions, email addresses, blah, environment that you want it to apply to. The really critical thing that you want to worry about here is with Merb mailer. Because the exceptions thing uses Merb mailer under the hood to send out the notifications, I highly recommend that you use the sendmail delivery method. Basically, the reason behind that is that you just rely on the MTA on your local system to do the right thing. So you can do whatever complex mail routing or rewriting the messages or authentication or whatever, and you let your Merb app do what it's good at doing, which is, being a Merb app, not being a mailer. Right, some general tips as we sort of wrap up. So SQLite 3 permissions, something that can be annoying if you're running a SQLite 3 app in production or whatever is that you may have deployed to a server somewhere, but you haven't set the permissions on the directory that your application is running from. It gives you all sorts of really weird errors, and basically you can't write to the database anymore, which is bad. So you set up the permissions on the directory that your app is sitting in, and magic happens. Another cool thing that's happened in the last few days, named instances. So basically what that allows you to do is you can give your instance a name within the configuration file in your config init.rb. So when you do a process listing, you can very visually see all the processes that are running on your system. The other cool thing about that with the logging is that when you look at the process tree, you can see the Merb master process being named, whatever the name you pass it, as well as all your child processes. And then when you send user 1 to the process or whatever, it will write out into the log file the configuration for all those individual nodes as well. I sort of forgot to mention that before. Right, the last thing is Ubuntu Ruby updates. So a lot of people probably use Ubuntu. I know I certainly do on their servers. You'll notice that because of the way that Ubuntu pushes their updates for things, you'll basically get like a version of Ruby that's on Hardy, for instance, that just doesn't work out of the box because of the RubyGems update that happens like a month after Ubuntu decided to release Hardy. So basically, if you install Ubuntu on a machine and you go gem install or whatever, it'll just sit there and chew up 100% of CPU and 70% of memory, which is bad. And unfortunately, because of the way that Debian and Ubuntu package Ruby, you can't download the update and install it. It just explodes magnificently. So the Brightbox sponsor a project for Ubuntu Ruby and Ubuntu Ruby backports. And they provide up-to-date packages for Ruby for all the different components as part of that, as well as Passenger. So you can just add this repository to your system, and then magically you can install Passenger out of the box, nicely configured, Debianized. Makes it really, really easy to do it. Right, so the take-home messages today are really, you need to get it right once, and then rinse and repeat. Also, don't repeat yourself because it's horribly ugly. But that said, you want to make sure that your infrastructure is repeatable and redeployable. Thank you very much. Do we have any questions?
You probably haven't gotten to it yet, but is the Intrepid release of Ubuntu any better?
So I'm running it on this laptop at the moment. Realistically, for a Rails deployment or a Merb deployment or whatever, you should absolutely always be using the LTS release, so Dapper or Hardy. There's just like the support lifecycle for a non-LTS release is 12 months. So you have a 12-month window to run that. And sure, you'll get the latest packages, but with the Brightbox repository, they do all the hard work for you. So use the LTS release with the updated packages. It's a lot easier. Yeah, totally. I'll make sure that I publish the slides as well.
So we're just putting the repository URLs back up?
Oh, we got a question down the front here.
So do you use Capistrano or do you use Thor instead of Capistrano?
So I very specifically didn't include anything about Capistrano or Vlad because I don't consider Merb deployment to be about those tools. I consider it to be about understanding all the different things that make up a deployment. So I really have no preference to Capistrano or to Vlad, sorry. I personally actually don't use either. I actually just do it all by hand. But that's because I'm using things like Puppet that do all the heavy lifting for me. Any more? Okay. Oh, wait, one more.
Use anything along with collect_d for the graphing besides just the standard CGI?
Sure. You can use Cacti, which is a PHP graphing thing that just talks to...
What was that called?
Cacti, C-A-C-T-I. You can plug it into other things like Xenos or Nagios if you wanted to. It just requires a bit of hacking. But Cacti, like the standard CGI script actually does a lot of good stuff for you out of the box anyway. I was only showing a small smattering of graphs. Like on a standard system, you get a very high level overview about how everything is happening. But certainly use Cacti if you want that amazingly low-level detailed information. Gone. Thank you very much.